Earth sample synthesis is a durational, installation-based, and eventually sculptural composition for earth samples, field recordings, and synthetic sound that borrows in various ways from the work of Douglas Webler, Pauline Oliveros, and Robert Smithson. Slowly evolving in real time, an otherwise hermetic circuit comprising the playback of field recordings and sound synthesis is opened up to the Earth, to environmental contingencies through the insertion of Earth samples into the electronic circuit which drives the piece. Audio and Earth samples for the piece were gathered as follows. A pentagon was superimposed upon a map, and initially this pentagon was supposed to be of a scale that required travel between different parts of the country to gather samples, but the imposition of a national lockdown required that this was scaled back to a more local area. At the site corresponding with each vertex point on the pentagon, a hole is dug and an Earth sample taken, along with a field recording from the site. The Earth samples gathered are contained in jars and inserted into the electrical circuit controlling sample playback and sound synthesis. Corresponding with each vertex is an electrical conductivity, or EC measurement, a field recording, and an oscillator, which takes its frequency from the ongoing EC measurements. A series of operations are then performed, allowing for the modification of the field recordings by synthetic tones being generated in response to these ongoing EC measurements. I'll return to these operations shortly, but first a little background. The piece forms part of a long-standing interest in the tensions between site-based practice, often associated with specificity, and abstraction, and specifically the movements between the two, the subjection of one to the other. Abstractions engendered through or atop the actuality of the site, and the return or introduction or reintroduction of abstractions to the particularities or specificities of the site. Here abstraction is considered less a reductive representation than a generative abstraction, an opportunity for transformation. This project occurs within my broader thinking on creative practice as a strategy for lived abstraction. Artistic practice as a strategy for situating oneself amid abstractions, for learning to live with abstractions, a means of engendering real abstractions through creative activities, to internalise and realise and come to terms with the reality of abstractions that project our collective futures, model the imperceptible realities of the physical world, and support our communications. Sight and abstraction, the poles of the dialectic guiding this particular composition, have formed a part of my work for some time. For example, in the Acoustic Subtraction series, wherein listeners around the world were exposed to 20 minutes of white noise followed by 20 minutes of silence in particular outdoor locations, which included Kielder Forest, Eyüp Mosque in Istanbul, tea houses in South Korea, and underdeveloped hinterlands of suburban Vienna. Another example of this site abstraction coupling is the development of acoustic models of architectural interiors, which was a key component of a 2010 installation composition called Space Against Itself. The artistic reference point for this particular piece are Douglas Webler's 1968 Wyndham College Pentagon and Pauline Oliveros' 1998 Primordial Lift. In '68, Webler drew a pentagon on a map with the location of Wyndham College, Putney, Vermont, at its centre. Webler then walked to each point, collecting an earth sample and a photograph at each. Earth samples were mixed with resin and displayed at the college as part of a residency, along with the artefacts of the work undertaken, maps, instructional text, and photographs. At the end of the residency, the earth samples were returned to the earth. Oliveros' Primordial Lift involves the slow glissando of an oscillator between 7.8 and 13 Hz, mirroring claims of a shift in the Earth's resonant frequency between the startlingly short timescale of just 50 years. This oscillator functions as an infrasonic modulation source, or LFO, for the processing of an ensemble via a range of effects and signal processing techniques. Oliveros' score also contains a 5-point star indicating routes that might be taken when combining and modifying the sounds of the instrumentalists in the ensemble, suggesting fades and transitions or matrix configurations and so on. Both Huebler and Oliveros' pieces share a focus on the Earth, albeit at radically different scales and via different methods of representation and abstraction. For Earth sample synthesis, Huebler's pentagon and Oliveros' star are combined or superimposed. Huebler's link between vertices and sites are maintained through the use of field recordings. As in Oliveros' piece, the operational, performative and compositional functioning of the star is used as an interface or a guiding structure for the transformation of sonic materials. For example, the pentagon will be taken to represent the field recordings, a map of the sites. The star will be taken as a modulation matrix comprising synthetic tones and EC measurements. The piece will begin with the field recordings indicated by each vertex being modified by the tones produced through EC measurements of the corresponding Earth samples. Field recording, tone, and EC measurements being in their original positions, therefore. The star will slowly be rotated about the pentagon, so that the field recordings are modified by signals generated from the Earth samples of the other sites. EC measurements may also function independently as modifier depth or index values. The rotation of the star atop the pentagon continues throughout the piece. Throughout the piece, the Earth samples are also to be manually contaminated with each other by a human operating more as a somewhat redundant gardener than a performer, using a spoon or a pipette, until they have been combined in equal amounts, reaching a homogeneous sum. This process of rotation and contamination of the sites and associated data will be undertaken patiently throughout the conference.